This game is called Inifinity Nikki. It's available for PlayStation 5, iOS, Microsoft Windows, and Android. It was developed by Paper Games and in full PTE Limited. As said here, Paper Games is a video game publisher and developer based in Jiangsu, China, while in full PTE Limited is apparently stationed in Singapore. China's population is 1.4 billion. Pre-pandemic, the demographic of African-descended people living there was about 500,000, which is only 0.04% of the population. Most of these individuals are African Black and not African American. Chinese people have a very diverse culture, ranging from different languages to various religions and dialects. The lifestyles of people living in urban areas differ significantly who live in the rural regions. And this diversity is spread across many locations because China is such a massive country. But speaking of size, China is slightly larger than the US in terms of land area. However, when you look at the census.gov website, you can see the stark contrast in population numbers between the two countries. China has about 1.4 billion people, while the US has only 340 million. That means China has over 1 billion more people than the US. And again, the majority of these individuals are ethnically Chinese. So when I see posts like this one from a woman on Reddit, all I can think about is sheer entitlement and a colonizer mentality. We're gonna go over her post in detail. I know she made some updates and I'll address those too, but since she put this out publicly and made herself a sounding board, putting on a spotlight on her opinions, I think it's important to talk about how frustrating and entitled this mentality can come across, likely without her even realizing that that's what's happening. To illustrate my point, I like to use analogies. So for this analogy, imagine if there was a game developed in Tanzania reflecting Tanzanian culture. How would it be received if a bunch of Chinese or white people got upset about the game not including enough diversity because they didn't see enough Chinese or white characters in it? Especially considering that those groups are a vast minority in that country. It would feel ridiculous, right? Yet we see this kind of attitude just prevailing specifically in the Western Hemisphere. Anyway, she starts by saying, listen. As a Black girl, I love this game. I think it's great, but there are some issues with it, mainly with the diversity. First of all, starting off with, as a Black girl, doesn't do anything for your argument. Precursoring the color of your skin and then immediately complaining about diversity is only going to make you sound like you're kind of salty because a Chinese person or Chinese developers didn't force Black people into their game. Your language comes across as though you think of yourself as extremely superior to Chinese people, like you're talking down at them, and as if they should listen to you simply because you're Black. That might not be your intention, but that's exactly how you're coming across. Now, I understand that things can get lost in translation through text, but you need to understand that this is the internet and people are going to take what you say at face value a lot of the time, specifically if it's in text. Unfortunately, your responses and the rest of your post didn't really do anything to help this impression. She said they've done some good though. I'll start by saying that getting rid of the attributes assigned to skin tones might have been the best decision this game's made. Dark skin tones were always sexy or mature or cool in Love Nikki, and that's genuinely terrible. I'm glad they removed that feature because I was not ready to have to change my skin tone to get a better score.
I can actually crack this right now. Let's go. Phantom Cat. 5-star, mature, sexy. There you go. You know what?
That clip was from VV Gaming. But yeah, in response to a comment she made here, I get what she's saying, and I somewhat agree. Even though it's often seen as a compliment, yes, if that's what was happening, assigning certain tones to specific it factors can be a divisive thing. So yes, I do agree with that. So here she talks about the skin tones and how having the ability to change them is a good thing, but then she argues there should be an extra dark one as well for more diversity. She also points out that the NPCs could use more diversity because it doesn't make sense that Nikki has the ability to change her skin tones, but the NPCs do not. She also mentions that if they're going to include the ability to change the skin tone, there should be a wider variety of hairstyles, particularly ones that pertain to 4-type textured hair, or as people would call it, kinky hair or Afro-textured hair, as we see in this clip with Bianca Renee today. For example, her hair would be more of a 3C texture, while this girl's hair is more of a 4B or 4A texture. Asian hair is often type 1, which is like super straight, just for some context because people probably don't know what the hell I'm talking about. If you're into hair and makeup, you'll learn this stuff real quick. What the fuck is she doing? Girl, I know exactly what... For those who get it, they get it. Anyway, since the previous game in the series already included this, she argues that this game, Inifinity Nikki, doesn't have any excuse not to. Her point is that if the game is all about customization, then they should be able to expand the options for players. She then expresses frustration of having to wait for these changes. Now, this later part, and honestly the majority of her posts up until this point, isn't so bad. As a player, she's just expressing that if the developers are going to include skin tones, they should also include matching hairstyles and providing more options since people from all over the world play the game. I'd even argue that if they're trying to cater to a global audience, then it would make sense to have that option. However, the disclaimer she adds afterward is probably where she's going to lose people. This is why it's so important to be mindful of how you talk to people, because many are already annoyed with individuals behaving entitled when it comes to East Asian developers. There's this attitude that they need to make their games fit neatly into the aesthetic and preferences of American people when the Asian market already has over 1 billion more people than America, specifically the Chinese market. Yes, these companies still use money from outside markets because it's profitable, so why not? But while we can want something from another country, it's not our job to feel entitled to them changing it for us. I know this might seem ironic because the US changes things all the time to please China because they want that Chinese money since China has more people. But at the same time, America shouldn't be made to change anything for other countries either. The American audience is what really matters when it comes to US produced content, and other countries likely feel the same about their own audiences. But there's this very narrow-minded viewpoint some people have where they think other countries exist specifically to cater to them, and they might not even realize that they're doing it, but that's exactly what it comes across as them doing. It's like if Africans made a game where most of the African women and men had their natural 4C, 4B, or 4A kinky curly hair textures and various styles, but none of them were straightened, I bet you'd have some Black Americans getting upset and saying, well, I mean, this is cute and everything, but can we have like a silk press once in a while, or a blowout, or a twist out, or a braid out? Like, the point is the game wasn't originally made for your audience or culture, and that's something to keep in mind. Yes, I'm aware that Africans wear their hair like that as well, but I'm just saying in this hypothetical scenario. So then she talks about her disclaimer. It says, before y'all start acting weird and talk about how the devs are Asian, so there's no way this could happen, shut up. Asian devs have done it before. It's not out of the question. Just look at Nintendo. I'm guessing she means Animal Crossing. I'm guessing that's Animal Crossing Horizons or something. Splatoon, Pokemon, just to name a few. It's possible. Some people just don't want to do it. And if you think they don't want to do it, what is the point of this post? I don't know. This is just a very unnecessarily aggressive and entitled way to respond. And it's really clear that this person is just plain ignorant because it seems like they're equating every single Asian country as being the same. Nintendo is Japanese. Do you think all Asian countries are exactly the same? I know a lot of people are ignorant about this, but for some perspective, here are all of the Asian countries, or rather a lot of them, right? We got Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, India, Pakistan, Laos, the Philippines, Yemen, and the list goes on. I think she's specifically talking about East Asia, but even in East Asia, there are different countries. These are the ones that people usually think about when they say Asians. Japan, Mongolia, South Korea, North Korea, China, etc. And if you look across these countries, they're vastly different. For example, North Korea and South Korea do not like each other. A lot of Chinese and Japanese people don't like each other either. As a matter of fact, I've noticed more ire from the Chinese people towards Japanese people. See, what a lot of people, especially Black Americans, don't realize is that during World War II, the Japanese Imperial Army took over like many thousands, tens of thousands of women. I think it was like over 200,000 or 300,000 women from China and Korea as things called comfort women, or like spicy slaves, if you know what I mean, like slaves you use to do the slurping human fleshlights. And they were also forced to do physical labor. Yeah, they were slaves. And I'm sure a lot of these women ended up having children from the men who used them in this way. And a lot of these people were also little girls, like not even full-on women. So I'm sure everybody can imagine having people occupy your country, take your women, and then breed them. This wasn't isolated to East Asia or Japan. It was common across almost every country you can think of, specifically in times of war, and yes, even in the African countries. They even took women from the Philippines, the Netherlands, Taiwan, Australia. I bet a lot of people didn't know that. But you know, the internet's awesome because you can just go and research and find this information. I'm not a freaking historian. I know about this because based on my interactions with my friends and my community, I've seen firsthand how much Chinese people really hated Japanese people. A lot of them still feel the same way today, specifically and especially the older generation. They're extremely racist towards Japanese people. I've already told the story about my Japanese friend when I went over to my Chinese friend's house. His mother gave me the biggest smile. Like, I loved her. We got along really well. And I think she was trying to like get me to like be with her son. I mean, that's just the vibe I was getting from it. You know, and she invited me in along with her other friends. But when she found out that one of our friends was Japanese, the guy that was with us, she basically cussed him out and would not let him inside of her house. Now, my friend Ho, yes, that was his name, Ho, he said that he'd get some food for the guy, and we were just kids, but I went outside and stayed with our Japanese friend. He was smiling through it and acting like it didn't bother him, but I could tell through his body language and you could see his face that it did bother him. It bothered him a lot. He was just a kid and he had no idea what he did wrong. He didn't know about the people back then. He's just a kid. And it was the same thing with Dr. Gould, my Chinese professor. He was one of the sweetest men I've ever met, my favorite teacher. But if I ever mentioned anything about Japanese people, Japanese inventions, or even Nintendo, like, he would get viscerally angry. He wasn't angry at me, but it was like he went to this other place and became a completely different person. He was severely racist against Japanese people to the point where he didn't even want his children playing with or using anything made in Japan or by Japan. He didn't even want it in his house at all. Like, damn, I had to calm him down after one of these very aggressive interactions. And after that, I kind of just avoided mentioning anything about Japanese people around him. The one time I brought up something related to Japanese culture, he went very quiet, and he's usually very talkative and smiling a lot, but he was like really quiet, wasn't smiling at all. And I realized, okay, it's probably best to leave it alone. And you're probably wondering, okay, why didn't you call him out on it? Honestly, it wasn't my place at the time because I was still very naive. I didn't understand what the hell was going on or what was wrong with him. I just knew, and I could pick up that for some reason he didn't like Japanese people, but I just didn't understand why at the time. I didn't understand why my friend's mom didn't like Japanese people either, but I learned later. And interestingly, I didn't get the same sentiment from Japanese people towards Chinese people, so it kind of felt weird. But between the history alone, like, people need to be mindful of these dynamics. They're not just one conglomerate. These are different groups of people with their own history separate from the Western Hemisphere. And while you might think that your history is the only one that matters, they have a whole history of their own, sometimes with events even more horrendous than those of certain other countries like the US. Keep in mind that the old Japanese government was allied with Nazi Germany. Even though they didn't actively participate in the Holocaust, they still allied with them. That was probably in part because they shared the similarities with the German regime when it came to expanding their rule. And Japan also occupied China and Korea during those times. So when this woman says, before y'all start acting weird and talk about how the devs are Asian, so there's no way this could happen, shut up. Asian devs have done it before. It's not out of the question. Just look at Nintendo, Animal Crossing, Splatoon, and Pokemon and all their games. She needs to be aware that she's ignorantly lumping all Asians into the same category. Not all Asians are the same, and not all East Asians are the same. The other issue with her statement is the idea that just because one East Asian company is doing something, it doesn't mean another one needs to follow suit. If a company wants to make their game with a specific aesthetic or style and then choose not to implement certain features, that's their decision. This ain't a Gambino music video. This ain't America. These games are Chinese. As players, we can tell them, hey, it'd be nice if you added this, or even say, I'm not playing this game because it doesn't have this, so I'm gonna boycott it, or I wish it had this, that's why I'm not playing it. You're free to do that, but swinging your tits around and slamming them on the desk of the Chinese developers while saying, well, look, Japan did it, why can't you? It's giving Johnny Somali vibes. There's this growing sentiment against Chinese people or East Asians in general when it comes to their games, or animated films, or shows. And it's particularly noticeable with some Americans, and I'm sorry to say specifically Black Americans, thinking there needs to be African descendant representation everywhere in everyone else's culture and media.
I remember my grandmother saying to me, I don't care what they tell you in school, Cleopatra was black.
And look, maybe this woman's heart is in the right place, though I'm a bit skeptical. Based on the overall tone of her post and specifically some of her replies or one of her replies, but this kind of entitlement only sets everybody back. It builds resentment towards the Black American community and by association, Africans and Caribbeans. Like, even though a lot of Africans overseas aren't talking about this, they don't care. They're busy making their own content or just living their lives. You don't see Africans saying, or Nigerians or Ugandans saying, damn, that game made for Chinese people and based in China, I need to see myself in it because I'm African and we have no culture. Like, come on. Furthermore, and I could be wrong, you don't see any other ethnicities doing this. And I honestly, like, there are a lot of Black Americans who don't like when people do this either, you know, because it makes everybody look entitled or the entire community look like they're begging for scraps. There's a way to suggest things without coming off like an entitled brat, expecting another country to bend to your will. You know what's weird? There are games in Korea where you can have diversity and customizable customizable options for hair, clothes, makeup, your face, and even body type, but they probably don't have many dark skin options because the vast majority of Korea's population isn't dark skin. Would it be nice to have that option? Sure. But it makes complete sense why a country with a vast majority of one specific ethnic group or phenotype would make their characters reflect that group rather than the 0.04% of people with different features in their country. Even if they're exporting their game to other countries, you can still play someone else's game, pretend to be the character, and not have to see your skin color on them to see yourself in them because you're playing a game based on another culture. That's like reading a romance book about a character, and if you're Korean, you can't identify with her because she's white and not Korean. That's stupid. And that's really shallow and kind of prejudiced. If you really have a problem with the customizable options not offering darker skin tones or a more variety of skin tones, then boycott the game. If you don't want to go to that extreme, start a petition to politely ask the developers or suggest to the developers, if you're in contact with them on their social media platforms, especially if you know that they're not being malicious, if they could add those customizable options. Just be mindful that this isn't America, and because you're not their main audience, they may not change it just for you. Be happy and grateful if they do. And if you're saying some people just don't want to do it, then that's on them. You're not their boss. Speak with your wallet. But this kind of behavior, telling you now, like especially towards Chinese people who are very proud, is not the best way to get the reaction you want. I do admit that there are a lot of Chinese people, especially older ones, who don't like African or Black people. You have to understand that they have very limited access to people outside of their culture and ethnicity. So acting like this might be the only interaction some of them have with someone from outside their community. Is this how you want to represent your community to a country that already has issues accepting people outside their culture? Just food for thought. Anyway, the original poster did make an update. She said, wow, this got traction. I want to say that my disclaimer was a bit misguided since all the examples I listed were from one country in Asia, and that obviously doesn't represent all of them. But what I'm trying to say is that it is possible. And while China is different when it comes to diversity in games, we should still be holding them to standards. So I apologize for being misinformed on that specific issue, but everything else still stands. Seeing different perspectives has been really interesting, so thank you for all the comments. Now, while I commend her for apologizing for being misinformed, and while I don't blame her for still standing on her issues, it's still very condescending. She's saying, oh, it's possible, as if the developers don't know that, or as if people don't already know that. We all know what's possible. It's based on whether or not the developer wants to do it. Also, holding them to the standard of diversity in the USA is a colonizer mentality. I'm sorry. Why should China be held to the diversity standard as the US when they don't possess the same demographics? Let's say, and I'm addressing the poster, not that she can hear me, but let's say you decide to make a game. Since you're a Black girl, you might decide, you know what, I want to make a game based in Tanzania. Now, 99% of the population in Tanzania is considered African or Black skin. So let's say you make this game and there are white people or Chinese people living in Tanzania too, obviously. Would you be okay with Chinese people or white people getting upset with you, being condescending, and wondering why you're not adding more diversity by including more white people, even though they're only 0.04, I was gonna say 0.04 of the population? And would you be one of those people who would look down on them for even asking that, wondering how they even had the nerve to bring it up when they're not even at a full 1% of the population? If you chose to add that kind of customization, it would be considered a luxury to those people, not a necessity. Because let's be real, if they all decide to boycott your game and not buy it, boo-hoo, it wouldn't make a dent. Dent where? Even if it would be a courtesy for you as a developer to add those options, what if your story was about ancient Africa or focused solely on Tanzanian culture or in a specific region? To be honest, the majority of the people who would buy the game probably wouldn't expect to see white people in that setting or Chinese people in that setting. In fact, they might see a random white person in the game and immediately think, what the hell is he doing there? Or you might add those elements to try and broaden people's horizons, which would be a good thing. But based on your attitude, I'd bet money that if someone was condescending towards you about this, saying that you should add white people or Chinese people to your game about Tanzania, or set in Tanzania where there's majority just dark-skinned people, you'd have a lot to say. You'd probably clap back hard at those people for being entitled or not respecting the culture your game is based on. I hope you wouldn't, because developers shouldn't do that. If you're asking people for money, it's a bad idea to go fighting with your audience. But anyway, one of the posters said this: a lot of people are bringing up the domestic market and diversity being a Western thing, but I'd like to point out that Paper Game's other well-known release, Love in Deep Space, great game by the way, has somewhat a larger pool of skin tone options than Inifinity Nikki currently has. I'd usually be less optimistic about skin tone options because one of the few things things most Asian cultures seem to agree on is not wanting to be any kind of tan. But if the Love and Deep Space main character can get that kind of range, Nikki can too. This is also why I'm not going to completely count out hairstyles with textured hair. And while this person is right, this is one of the reasons why people are starting to push back against diversity, which is going to hurt everything that we've all worked so hard to build up. Just because a specific game in the same genre or even by the same developers includes a lot of skin diversity doesn't mean they have to put it in every single one of their games. And honestly, it's also a very ignorant way to look at things because you're basically saying that if there are no dark-skinned people in something, it's not diverse. Before any of these countries even knew about people from different places that had different skin colors, they were still considered very diverse. Human beings as a species are diverse. You don't need your skin color to prove that. If you have a group of people with different skin tones, but they all share the exact same hive mind, beliefs, and mentality, it doesn't matter how different their skin color or hair texture is. They're only diverse in appearance, but not in thought. But even if you look closer, you'll find that's not true either. Diversity is more than just skin color, and I think that's what people are forgetting. This is why people are starting to get turned off whenever they see others pushing for ethnic diversity in a way that feels controlling and entitled. This other country over here, which barely has any black people in its population, must cater to me in the West and include people that look like me in the game because the other game did it, so now all the other games must do it. That attitude comes off as very snobby and distasteful, and as a result, people are going to start running for the hills whenever they see this kind of behavior. This other poster very politely puts it, and they say, I get this view, but I think it doesn't really matter. Them removing skin tone based points is absolutely a great thing, and I'm glad they did it too, but I've recently been watching Black Lightning, the superhero series, and not once during my viewing did I think, well, this is great, but I want more representation, you know? We need to remember that Inifinity Nikki is made by a Chinese company. China is 91% Han Chinese and just under 9% ethnic minority, which includes white people. It's actually a higher percentage of ethnic Chinese. But anyway, I guess I just think including diversity as an afterthought is more disrespectful than not having diversity at all, you know? And you know what? I completely agree. Them throwing in diversity because black people are gonna bitch about it is just more insulting than if they genuinely wanted to include black people in their games out of interest or respect. We shouldn't have to force people from a different country or ethnicity to insert a culture that's different from theirs or elements from other countries' cultures into their games just because that's what we or those specific people want. This is why Americans get a bad name and white people call Americans entitled. And attitudes like this, or white people look at black Americans automatically think that all they care about is their black skin and oppression, and that's all their identity boils down to, when that's not the truth. If you want to know the quickest way to get a company to change something you'd like to see in their game, go and support a company that already includes those things. Or play a game, even if it's one of theirs, that offers those options. It's also interesting to see what some other people are saying, because these posters said, I'd say if NPC were to get diverse, it's more probable later on, as the current areas seem to be inspired by Italy, Austria, and Czechia a bit. Those countries are European and where white complexion is more likely, though perhaps more skin tones would be awesome for sure. I mean both character and NPC, though Nikki is actually her own character and not a self-insert. The other person below that says, off subject a bit, as many have already said, they're eyeing adding more tones, but I wonder if they're being cautious or so cautious due to how horrible Love Nikki went. Once bitten, twice shy sort of thing. I skipped over Shining Nikki, so I don't know how their skin tones worked. So yeah, I think context matters as well. All in all, if you're buying a game from another country, keep that in mind. If you want diverse characters, aka more black skin or tan skin characters, then you can specifically search for games with those terminologies or tags like Africa. Glam, fashion, drama, I think there's a game where you specifically can have just those options. Otherwise, just enjoy games for what they are. Since these countries don't share the same culture or ideals as the US, be polite and kindly suggest what you like about the game or what you like to see in the future. That being said, what do you guys think about the original post? Do you think I'm being too hard on her point of view or maybe too sensitive? Should I give her a little bit of leeway because this is an important matter that should be discussed and pushed? Do you think she was right in expecting this, considering that this Chinese company wants American people to buy their game too and they need to be aware that black people exist? Or do you think that she was being too entitled by expecting this from a Chinese company while also being a little condescending and suggesting that China should be like Japan in terms of diversity. Do you think viewpoints like this actually harm the push for ethnic diversity, or do they help it? Maybe people aren't speaking up enough, or maybe it's not the fact that they're speaking up, but how they're doing it. And maybe there's an argument that if no one ever said anything, nothing would change. After all, people like me will go and talk about things from a consumer's point of view about why I didn't like something. And I'll always say that it's important for us to voice our opinions so companies can understand why these things matter to us or why we don't like things. So maybe this poster is just doing the same thing. Regardless of my opinion or anyone else's, it's still good that we can talk about these things whether we agree or disagree.
As of the beta test 2, there were 3 available skin tones. While the range from the darkest to the lighter tone is better than perhaps some other games that I've been on my name list, but there's certainly room for variety, so we'll see that over time. I had so much fun creating different styles. I created like a Final Fantasy 7 Tifa inspired outfit.